In this next section, we're going to take a look at the fuel delivery system on our internal combustion engines. Try to get our head wrapped around how we get the fuel into that engine mixed with the air so that it runs correctly. And we're going to dive into looking at carburetors and fuel injectors and other devices like that. But the first thing I want us to do is make sure we understand what the goal of this fuel delivery system is. And primarily there are three things that has to happen, three things that the fuel delivery system has to do. First of all, it's got to deliver the right amount of fuel. I got to make sure that there's the right amount going in for how the engine is operating, what's being demanded from it, how fast it's running, how much air is going into that engine, and so forth. So I got to have the right amount of fuel going in there. I got to make sure that that fuel is atomized, which means it's got to be in as fine of particles as possible. I don't want big droplets of fuel going into that engine because I also have to make sure that that fuel is well mixed with the air. So I want really, really small droplets of fuel that are mixed around with the air. And hey, here's what's got to happen. I've got to make sure that every molecule of that fuel that's in that engine is very close to a molecule of air, of oxygen, so that when the reaction happens, when the combustion happens, when it burns, that it's got oxygen there that it can burn efficiently. And we'll look at that reaction later. But that's a really key thing that has to happen. And so three things that this fuel delivery system has to do. Again, right amount of fuel, it's got to be a really, really, really tiny droplet, it's got to be atomized, and it's got to be mixed with the air. And we'll see that some of these systems are actually controlling the airflow that's coming into the engines. Some of them aren't necessarily, so the airflow is controlled separately, and we'll see that as we go through. But we've got to keep in mind our two fundamental kinds of engines, our spark ignition and compression ignition engines, and the differences between those two. And the difference is where that fuel comes in. So if we look at our spark ignition engine, the primary thing about the spark ignition engine is what I'm drawing into the engine on that intake stroke as that piston comes down. It's pulling in a mixture of fuel and air. So there's both fuel and air. It's mixed in there. And so when it gets compressed in that piston, it's the fuel-air mixture that gets compressed. In the compression ignition engine, it's different. What I pull into the engine is dry air, no fuel in that air, just plain air only. So I draw that air into the engine, I compress that air and get it up to a high pressure, get it above the auto ignition pressure of that fuel, then I inject the fuel into there. So one of the advantages of the spark ignition system is that because I'm injecting that fuel or introducing that fuel upstream from the piston, there's a longer amount of time for that fuel to get mixed with the air so that as it comes in the engine, it's coming in, it's swirling around, I compress it, that adds energy to the particles that are running around. So I have a better chance, an easier chance of getting that fuel mixed with the air before I combust it near top dead center of the piston. On the compression ignition engine, I'm relying on my injection device, and we'll look at these a little bit. We'll look at that injector and what it looks like, but it's got to be able to spray that fuel into that combustion chamber. It's got to make it really, really fine particle sizes. It's got to spread it all the way through so that I get good mixing of that air and the fuel in this high pressure chamber because I've already compressed this air above the auto ignition pressure of that fuel. So it's ready to go. It's ready to burn. So those are the primary differences. So let's summarize that again and understand the difference. In a spark ignition engine, the fuel is introduced before the cylinder. So I'm pulling the fuel-air mixture into the cylinder. In a compression ignition engine, the fuel is introduced into the cylinder. So what I'm pulling into the engine is clean air. So it's a different kind of device that makes that happen. So in the spark ignition engine, we use a lot of carburetors, and we'll look at carburetors and how they work. And the carburetor, here's a picture of one, is what's going to mix that air with that fuel as it's being drawn into the engine. In the compression ignition engine, I'm going to have a lot of pumps, high pressure pumps and lines, hoses that are taking that fuel, pushing that fuel into each individual cylinder. But now we're also going to talk about the fact that a lot of our spark ignition engines are fuel injected. And is that the same fuel injection that we have in a compression ignition engine? Wait a minute, I'm confused. We're going to unravel that and get our heads wrapped around, okay, what is the difference between the injection that happens in a compression ignition engine versus the injection that happens in a spark ignition engine? So we'll try to unravel and unpack all that stuff. So here's the roadmap of how we're going to handle this. So we're going to start with the spark ignition engines first, and we're going to look at the carburetor principles, how a carburetor works. We'll kind of delve into carburetors a little bit and show you some of the features, and as we get more and more complicated in these carburetors, what's happening, what's going on in there. We'll also look at some fuel injection technology. When we talk about fuel injection in a spark ignition engine, we'll explain what we mean there. We'll also look at the compression ignition engine. We'll talk about the injection system and what they look like, what kind of components are involved there. And at the end, we're going to look at a little bit of modern control, because we're going to see how all this stuff is leading to modern engines and all the electronics on the engine. We're going to start to understand what some of this modern control is going on inside the engine. So that's the roadmap. That's how we're going to handle this. So we'll dive first into the spark ignition, into the carburetor principles.